The world is still grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a critical moment in the outbreak response. For us all, the fastest way for us to get through this is to act together.
In the spring of 2020, as a microscopic but deadly virus brought the world to a grinding halt, the President of the United States fixed his ire on an unlikely target.
We will be today terminating our relationship with the World Health Organization and redirecting those funds to other worldwide and deserving, urgent global public health needs.
The organization, once lauded for ridding the world of smallpox and bringing polio to the brink of eradication, has become a political flashpoint. Great Decisions investigates the global response to COVID-19, explores how geopolitical rivalries are spilling over into the realm of public health, and asks how the international community can prepare for the next pandemic. The World Health Organization. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
In the last week of May 2020, as an anxious spring rolled into a tragic summer, the 100,000th American died from COVID-19, and Donald Trump stepped into the Rose Garden to prosecute his case against the People's Republic of China.
Chinese officials ignored their reporting obligations to the World Health Organization and pressured the World Health Organization to mislead the world when the virus was first discovered by Chinese authorities.
At issue were the early weeks of the outbreak. American officials alleged that China was too slow to warn the rest of the world about the dangers of the new virus.
Certainly probably November and December of 2019, there was likely an outbreak happening in Wuhan that China hid from WHO and really only let WHO know on December 31st, 2019. And much of January, as WHO tried to get more information, China was hiding that information and just not being as forthcoming as it should have been.
It wasn't a shortage of proper rules and regulations that allowed China to obstruct the World Health Organization investigation for too long. It was a problem of China, first and foremost, being obstructionist, not being transparent, being more concerned about its reputation than about averting a global pandemic.
We now have a name for the disease, and it is COVID-19.
It's quite clear that China was relying on WHO to delay the response to the COVID-19 and also to understate the severity of COVID-19 in the early stage. And I think Beijing has made it very clear that they don't care who's responsible as long as China is not held responsible.
As COVID-19 exploded into a worldwide pandemic, some experts worried that the international response was leaderless and uncoordinated.
It requires coordination at every level, globally, nationally, and locally. And we're seeing a real patchwork of responses that, frankly, is undermining our ability to beat this virus.
There's not a clear global leader in the fight against COVID. In some ways, WHO is the closest that we have, and I think they're pretty valiantly trying to play that role, but they're doing it with limited capacity and very limited authority, and at the mercy of member states' willingness to cooperate.
With tensions mounting between the US and China, President Trump announced that the US, traditionally the largest contributor to the World Health Organization, would stop funding that institution.
Leaving the World Health Organization at the height of the most devastating pandemic in more than a century is the height of lunacy. It impedes the US ability to learn from other countries. It creates open season for China to step in and drive the World Health Organization in the direction that China thinks is in its interest. It's a humanitarian blow to vulnerable communities all around the world, which in turn is a blow to US leadership and US influence.
That WHO was deliberately delaying the announcement of the severity, or delaying or artificially underestimating or understating the severity of COVID-19, at least in the early stage of the pandemic. As late as February 4th, the Secretary General of the WHO was still saying that there's no need for a country to overreact to COVID-19.
Just because something is called the World Health Organization doesn't mean it's an unmitigated good that you can't criticize. I've had experience with the World Health Organization since my days in the Reagan presidency, and it's not the lean, mean, disease-fighting machine it was right after it was created in its early years, where it had enormous success.
Mass infection and epidemics are a threat to every city, to every nation. Scientific and medical work on a local scale are no longer enough.
When delegates from around the world convened in San Francisco in the waning days of World War II to outline a framework for global governance, they made certain that health would be part of the mandate for the new United Nations. They recognized that the fight against infectious disease depended on global coordination.
They had experienced the health consequences of the Second World War, of course, and they were very clear that one would only have economic development in the world if one also had a healthy population.
There were epidemics of tuberculosis and other epidemic diseases, and there was risks of dysentery and other, risks to health, that people were moving around populations and so on after the war. So it was agreed that WHO would be formed and that there would be international cooperation.
What it tries to do is to provide technical guidance to countries around the world on how to respond to health challenges. It tries to set standards with the input of countries around the world for the response to global health crises, to medical issues, to public health issues.
Even during the most antagonistic years of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union managed to cooperate on matters of health.
The eradication of smallpox originated with a resolution proposed by the Soviets. It is the only human disease ever to have been eradicated. But think about that. In the 20th century alone, 300 million people are thought to have died of smallpox.
But after a few decades, many observers had grown discontent with the WHO and its broadening mission.
If you take a look at what the organization prides itself on, which is the near eradication of polio, the eradication of smallpox, combating other infectious diseases, these were the focus of the organization in its early days. And the organization lost its focus in the 1970s and 1980s and started focusing on a number of different issues that arguably should be the focus of domestic health agencies and domestic governments.
I remember back in the Bush 41 administration, the early Clinton administration, the global response to HIV/AIDS was taken out of the WHO and made a separate UN component because people simply felt the World Health Organization wasn't up to the challenge. And I think since then, the bureaucracy hasn't gotten any better.
Like many other international organizations, the WHO has no mechanism to enforce its authority and relies on achieving consensus from its member states.
No one gave WHO the authority to enforce compliance. No country wanted them to have that degree of authority, including the United States, so they simply don't have it.
Member states, when things like health security crop up, get incredibly defensive, nationalistic, and the WHO has to navigate. It doesn't have the authority to tell other governments what to do.
It has to also play a political role because WHO can be invited into a country, but they can also be kicked out of a country. We saw this recently with COVID-19, where Burundi expelled 3 WHO high officers. And so WHO has to kind of walk this line.
We have the authority that the member states give us. WHO is what its 194 member states want it to be. And really, it is not a question of exercising authority or compelling member states to do something. It is about persuasion. And that really is how the multilateral system works.
In 2002, doctors in southern China began documenting an alarming outbreak. Patients infected with a new type of virus were developing a condition known as severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. Faced with the threat of this contagious new virus, the WHO sprang into action.
It had a very strong director general, a woman named Gro Brundtland, who was a former prime minister. And when China at that point was not being very forthcoming with data about what was happening with SARS, she took a pretty strong stance and chastised China and really pushed China to be much more forthcoming about the data that was coming out of the SARS outbreak.
WHO had criticized governments in the past for not being transparent about health emergencies going on within their borders or infectious disease outbreaks, and had been heavily criticized for that. And Brundtland went ahead and did it anyway.
But in the aftermath of the SARS outbreak, the WHO's member states grew concerned about how much authority the organization had appropriated.
The overall reaction from member states was kind of, great job, don't do it again. The naming and shaming function, calling for trade and travel restrictions were all things that made governments uncomfortable more broadly as sort of an infringement on sovereignty.
What came out of SARS was something called the International Health Regulations, sort of a set of rules of the road that WHO and all the countries were supposed to follow in the context of cross-national disease outbreaks. And part of IHR was the idea that WHO should not chastise and really stand up to the member states.
As I have said before, and I can repeat, it took much too long time before we got that kind of collaboration to get the data and to know what advice to give and how to help them contain the outbreak. It took much too long time.
There are no IAEA-like authorities within the International Health Regulation, and that was not an oversight. I was on the negotiating side for the United States, and it was a very deliberate decision.
For most of the WHO's existence, it has relied heavily on the U.S. to finance its operations.
Traditionally, the United States has been the largest provider of funding to the World Health Organization, both in terms of assessed funding, which is sort of the dues to the organization, but also in terms of voluntary contributions to the organization as well.
When WHO started, it was mainly these assessed contributions by member states. Right now, we actually have a balance that the assessed contribution by member states are only 20% of the WHO's budget.
About 80% of its funding comes in the form of voluntary contributions from donors, mostly member state governments like the US, but also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a huge one. And that money is largely earmarked, meaning that the donors decide what they want it to be used for.
Concerns about the WHO's independence have grown now that the voluntary contributions controlled by member states make up the vast majority of the organization's budget.
This changed over time because wealthy countries pushed to reduce the mandatory contributions and replace them in some way with voluntary contributions. And the implications for the organization are enormous.
That opens up the WHO to the highest bidder in terms of who provides funding is going to have more political influence. And that was one of the major issues thus far in the COVID response, is that they're really focused on making sure that they don't upset anybody.
Within the past decade, several international commissions put forth proposals to modernize the WHO. Not one of those reforms was put into action.
What is the core of the proposed reform? For member states to provide greater powers of independence for the WHO Director General and his or her secretariat to collect data, and secondly, to issue warnings, and when data is not forthcoming, to blow the whistle internationally on why that data is not forthcoming. At present, all these reform proposals that have been put on the WHO table have been allowed to drift away by WHO member states.
Now that the COVID-19 pandemic has awakened the world to the potential danger of emerging disease, experts debate whether the WHO needs broader authority to enforce its mandate.
No, the World Health Organization doesn't have any kind of enforcement authority. It really shouldn't have enforcement authority. This is a situation where member states need to come together to work together to pledge to honor certain standards and certain practices.
It's not ultimately just about putting some authority on paper to say the Director General can do X, Y, or Z. It's also about thinking through the steps of, why would a member state then actually choose to comply with that?
So if WHO gets the authority to be able to go into China against China's will, then it needs to have the authority to go into the United States against America's will. My sense is this is a nice idea, but countries are not ultimately going to agree to it. Certainly not the United States, not China.
Some critics assert that the WHO is no longer the best organization to coordinate global health.
This was a different virus. This was a house on fire. And WHO is simply not, at this time, geared to be a fireman.
It was created in 1948. There were 48 member states. Now, fast forward today, we have 194 member states. Many of those states are low and middle income countries, and they require very different things from WHO.
We still need the WHO no matter what. We need that official body. But the question is, do we need some complementary entity that would be able to do this inspection or audit kind of approach?
Or will we end up in a situation where we have nothing because the states weren't really able to cooperate with a China that's challenging not only the United States, but the whole liberal world order and its principles?
As the WHO's assessed contributions from nation-states have tailed off, some private organizations have stepped in to fill the void.
Its funding is incredibly precarious. It is tremendously underfunded. It has this tremendous mandate to cover sort of all health issues all over the world, and it does that on a budget that's about the budget of a large hospital system in the US.
About 10% of the overall WHO budget is now also financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, again, mainly in focus programs.
USA! 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 USA!
With a nationalist tide sweeping the globe, politicians are proving increasingly unwilling to tolerate interference from multilateral institutions. The WHO must figure out how to operate effectively in a difficult geopolitical environment.
There is a rise of nationalism in very many places, and it does affect the WHO indirectly by making some countries less likely to contribute or be supportive of multilateral initiatives.
To what extent the great powers are willing to manipulate international organizations to serve their own cause, to implement their own agenda, that's really the problem. And that's an independent problem from nationalism.
What you have now is nationalist rhetoric, but internationalist challenges. It's not a coincidence that nationalist leaders, by and large, have fared the least well in tackling the COVID pandemic because they're trying to bring a set of tools to bear that don't take account of our connectedness.
The first step, some experts say, is to evaluate whether China's influence within the WHO has grown too strong.
The World Health Organization was concerned that if it was very critical of China and its lack of cooperation, lack of transparency, that could restrict further the World Health Organization's access to Wuhan and access and cooperation that the Chinese government was getting. So it was over the top in terms of its praise for China.
China has been very skillful at entering and penetrating a lot of international institutions that were really created as part of the liberal Western world order and based on liberal values such as transparency and openness, etc. But China, when it enters these institutions, although it subscribes to them, it signs all the agreements, it doesn't respect the rules.
One of the reasons WHO was subservient to China in the coronavirus pandemic was that a Chinese national had been Director General for 10 years before the current DG. And I think that's a mistake.
Every member state in every international organization tries to get its way. To the degree that China has influence that it should not have within the WHO, that's a failure of the Trump administration and of diplomacy and of other countries to build coalitions to block China's efforts.
At a moment of rising tension between Beijing and Washington, the WHO has become a battleground.
COVID-19 has fallen smash in the middle of a geopolitical conflict between the United States and between China. For political reasons, the United States has held back and has not joined many of these attempts to create a truly global approach.
One of the big worries I had was that if one of the big countries does badly domestically, if COVID really hits them badly, then the big danger is they will then externalize that into geopolitics. And the Trump administration decided the WHO was a good way of critiquing and harming China.
The challenge currently facing American policymakers is to determine how the U.S. can play a leadership role in the field of health.
In a bipartisan way, most people have recognized that investments in developing health systems is an investment in U.S. national security. So I think it is a mistake to go looking for credit if your investments in global public health infrastructure are only about that. You are missing the point.
People don't talk about smallpox anymore because the United States led on this, provided the funding to do that. Polio is another one that we're close to eradicating, and so we know how to do this. It's going to take all of us working together.
Other countries work within the institutions to push back at China, whereas the United States chooses more and more to depart from these institutions, probably because China and the US are main opponents in the world order, and China is trying to push the United States down from being the dominant power in the world.
A lesson of COVID is, maybe the overarching lesson, is that there is no them. It is just us. We are all susceptible to the same microbes. Individually, we are no match for nature, but together we are. I cannot imagine, even now, the US actually leaving WHO. It is, to me, unthinkable.
Going forward, the most crucial question will be what lessons the international community can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic to make sure it responds more effectively to the next emerging disease. Back in 1948, the WHO's constitution boldly proclaimed that The achievement of any state in the promotion and protection of health is of value to all. But today, the stakes for the global community are even higher. In our interconnected world, the failure of any state is a danger to all.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Next time on Great Decisions. Although the world faces a host of challenges that no country can solve alone, Americans are notoriously ambivalent about the appeal of multilateralism. The end of the global order? Next time on Great Decisions.